I'll be giving a presentation today on the Fitzpatrick Harp, the 15th century Trinity College harp, the earliest surviving medieval cláirseach, an archetypical icon of Gaelic identity, shows the heraldic crest of the Mac Giolla Phádraig clan of Upper Ossory carved into the wood adorning the harp's forepillar. Is this merely a decorative coincidence, or is there a connection between this famous artifact and the lords of Upper Ossory? All right, so today's talk will be on the Fitzpatrick Harp. You will know this harp because it's super famous. It's called by very many names, but I think that we have finally found the answer as to why we should call it just one name, the Fitzpatrick Harp on cláirseach Mac Giolla Phádraig. It also happens to be that I'm giving this talk on today, October 16th, which happens to be International Harp Day. I didn't come up with this holiday. I think there are several harp organizations or people who are dedicated to the study of early Gaelic harps, which are different from continental European harps. And they've decided to nominate this day to be for the Irish Harp or International Harp Day, a day for all harps. But it's actually a kind of a big thing in Ireland and for people who play harps and who study harps. And we just happen to have our gathering on the same day. And I just happen to pick today. This was not coordinated. So I just want to let you guys know that elsewhere in Ireland, lots of other harp scholars and musicians are actually talking about this harp and other harps and the study of harps and the playing of harps on this very day. So it's sort of significant. So that's just a happy, felicitous coincidence. This presentation is based off of my paper, which won the 2021 Fitzpatrick Scholarship Prize, which we'll be publishing in our journal later this year. And I just want to also plug the fact that we do have a journal now. So we'll put information on our website. We'll hopefully have more people who want to submit entries for our journal in the next round, and we can talk about that later. But I must be quick because there's much ground to cover on this. So let's see if I can get this done in half an hour. Okay, so the Trinity College harp is the primary name of the harp that sits in Trinity College, Dublin. It's a very, very famous artifact. It was first discovered in Limerick in modernity, but now it's been housed at Trinity College, Dublin since 1782, where thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people have walked by and looked at this iconic harp that's sitting there in the library. Its exact origins are completely unknown. It's really a mystery. But it does have two other names. It's known as the Brian Boru harp, or it's also known to a lesser extent as the O'Neill harp, and we'll talk about the reasons for that. It is the most famous harp in the world, and it's probably or possibly the world's most famous instrument. It has been the symbol of Ireland for a very long time, the harp in general, and this harp specifically in modernity. It is the archetype that's used for the Irish state insignia on the coat of arms. It's on the euro coinage. It was also used by Guinness. Before it was even used by the Irish state, it was used by Guinness as its logo. And so the world has come to know harps in general, and specifically this harp, as the very symbol of Irish identity. It's a physical object, just like the American Liberty Bell or the British Crown. It's a physical object that has come to have iconographic status that signifies Ireland and Irishness. A little note about these harps, though. This style of harp, it's usually an aristocratic object. Okay, so Joan Rimmer, the late Joan Rimmer, world harp expert, she says the harp has generally been an aristocratic high art instrument, and nowhere more so than in Ireland in medieval times. It was a valuable object produced by an expert instrument maker and often exquisitely decorated. A harpist was a skilled, specialist musician, and no poor man could have maintained or hired one any more than he could maintain a racehorse today. So these instruments, they took a lot to produce, and even when you had one fully made, you couldn't put it in the hands of anyone. You had to have somebody who was skilled at playing the harp. And therefore, it becomes sort of a status object. And generally speaking, that makes them rare. But it does give incentive for the upper classes who have the means to spend this kind of money to produce these harps. They have an interest in doing so. William Tytler gave a comment on Scottish harpistry, because we have to always be mindful that the culture of medieval Ireland was also shared across the North Channel in medieval Scotland. And it really wasn't until after 1600 that the cultures begin to diverge. They have their own different political histories always, but the cultural history between the two Gaelic nations of Ireland and Scotland were very close, right up through 1600. And so he writes that in the family of every chief, a head of a clan, the bard was a very considerable person. His office upon solemn feasts was to sing or rehearse the splendid actions of the heroes, the ancestors of the family, which he accompanied with the harp. So what we see here is an insight into Gaelic culture, how the harp and the harpists that played them served purposes of their lords that went a little bit beyond entertainment. Okay, so it's not just to make music and to have just nice sounds in the background, but rather there was always in sort of an undercurrent with the playing of harps, the background of status and trying to aggrandize the Lord. I mean, that's what the harpist is getting paid to do. He's not going to sing songs. He's not getting paid to make other people look good. He's going to augment his Lord's court, not only with his beautiful harp, not only with the beautiful music, but the songs and the types of things that he'll sing about will generally be things that the Lord is specifically interested in. The man's martial prowess, his largesse, his generosity, and above all, his genealogical descent, which gives him a right to claim the land or claim the position that he is in. So these went hand in hand. And so we see that in medieval Ireland and also medieval Scotland, harps and harpists were, I wouldn't want to say a political tool, but they certainly served a political purpose. And that was something that only the elites could afford to do and only really had a vested interest to do. But that's also important because with that comes a somewhat predictable idea that if the harp is going to be decorated and if it's going to be used in song to extol the virtues and ancestry of whatever lord, that it might be probable that the images that are adorning that harp might also comport with that particular lineage, right? So if the harp is going to sing the praises of a lineage, it might very well have images associated with that lineage on the physical body of the harp, on the instrument itself. So we see in 1600s Ireland the collapse of the Gaelic order, and we also see after that the harpers lose their patronage. There are just less and less lords in Ireland who are willing to spend money on the extravagance of a court harper. And so over the course of the 1600s, as the culture begins to change, harpers lose their position. Prior to 1600, when Brand Law was enacted, just so everyone knows, it was actually in Brand Law that the harpist would sit near the king or would sit near the chief as required by law. But what we see afterwards, when the Gaelic order is destroyed in Ireland or is collapsing, that harpers become itinerant wanderers, and they actually ironically wind up becoming folk musicians amongst the poor. Many of these harpers are blind, where it's actually one of the few skills that a blind person can undertake with mastery that would allow them to feed themselves. There's sort of like I wouldn't say a trope, but an archetype in Irish culture of the blind harper. And many of the harpers have the name Dáil, or Dálan, which it signifies they've lost their sight or that they are blind. So this is how harping survives in Ireland after 1600. It becomes a folk tradition that is kept around by wandering harpers who will go from court to court seeking their bread for a tune. Okay, but that being said, it also needs to be said that the aristocratic past of harps is sort of captured in memory, and many of the harps that come down to us today have a legacy of that. They have names of specific monarchs, like the Brian Boru harp, named after the famous High King of Ireland, the Queen Mary harp of Scotland, named after Queen Mary. And many of them have depictions of crowns or other royal trappings or declarations of nobility that kind of surround the harp. So there is this sort of mythology of the harp that remains, even though the harpers are poor and they're no longer hosted at courts for the most part. There is this intact memory of them where they used to be, what status they used to hold. Okay, so how does this harp come to modern light? Well, it was discovered, quote unquote, discovered by two antiquarians. It was discovered in Limerick City by William Burton Cunningham and also Chevalier Thomas O'Gorman. Both of these guys were upper class guys who have colorful histories of their own. They were both West Claremen, and it's an interesting little twist of fate that O'Gorman descends from the MacGorman chiefs of Ibracane in Western County Clare, and he had lost a lot of his patrimony through the Cromwellian confiscations, and Cunningham's family had actually inherited some of that. Fate brought them together when they were looking for antiques and items of antiquity in Ireland, and they were alerted to the presence of this harp that was being kept by Ralph Ousley in the city of Limerick. And so they eventually transported this to Trinity College, Dublin in 1782, where it has since remained, and it has now taken on the name, the Trinity College Harp. However, along with the harp itself came a provenance of the harp, a list of all the places, the chain of custody. Where did this harp come from, and who had it in their custody, and how did it get down to Limerick City? And it begins, according to this legend, or according to the narrative, it begins with the 10th century High King Brian Boru. And this comes down to us in two versions, which we'll go through in a little bit. There's a slight difference in each of the two versions, but this is the native tradition about it, that it comes down. And by and large, historians doubt the tradition. Okay, so here it is. It begins with Brian Boru, who was famously killed at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, then was taken by his son Donogha, who had assassinated one of his brothers, and as an act of penance brought it to Rome and gifted it with other things from the O'Brien clan, supposedly to the Vatican as an act of penance. And there it sits, the Vatican, for a number of years, centuries, until either Leo X, Pope Leo X, gifts it to King Henry VIII as part of his papal title of Fide Defensor. Back before Henry embarked on Anglicanism, he had written a very strong treatise against Martin Luther, and the papacy was so thrilled with this that they bestowed upon the English king the title Fide Defensor, Defender of the Faith. And so as sort of a gift that goes along with that also comes this harp. Or another version of the story says that it was given by Pope Innocent XI to King Charles II. It's a matter of debate, but we have these two variations. One comes from Ralph Ousley's letter, and another comes from a recording of the same through Charles Valancy. Anyway, so it then goes to the first Earl of Clanricarde, and then later it goes from, and by the way, the Clanricardes were the Burkes, or the de Burgos, the de Burrs, and so it passes through a marriage through a lady of the de Burr family, or the Burke family, to the McMahons of Clonagh. Now I have them in red. I want you to just pay attention to them now. Just note that in your mind, the McMahons of Clonagh. No relation to the McMahons of up in the north in Monaghan, the old kingdom of Oriel. There's another group of McMahons in County Clare and the surrounding areas that are Dalcassians. They're related to the O'Briens. And I know this because my mother is a McMahon of Oriel, not a McMahon of Clare. But the McMahons of Clonagh in County Clare come into possession of the harp. And then it goes from them to Councillor McNamara of Limerick, then Ralph Ousley of Limerick, and Chevalier Thomas O'Gorman finds it, who gives it to Colonel William Burton Cunningham, who gives it to Trinity College. So that's the provenance in a nutshell. And scholars doubt this, not because there's reason just to doubt native tradition on its own. Usually traditions are very, very good at preserving information. But when you look at the harp, it doesn't seem to have the same construct that from the 11th century, the 1000s. It really does appear to be from the 1400s, or at least that seems to be the academic consensus, but they really can't say much more about it. It's really a mystery. So historians dismiss this. Like the Tara brooch, it seems to have a high degree of romanticism, to try to connect a harp with this famous Irish high king increases its visibility, increases its value. Just like the Tara brooch doesn't actually come from the kings of Tara, but it has this name attached to it. However, the narrative might have some truth in its latter portions. Famous harpist and harp maker Paul Dooley writes that the Trinity College harp, assumed to be from the 15th century, that's the 1400s, is the oldest surviving harp in Ireland, and quite possibly the oldest surviving triangular framed harp in Europe. The history of this particular harp is obscure, and nothing is known of its makers. It is known to this day as the Brian Boru harp, but its associations with the famous High King appears to be nothing more than a romantic fabrication. The date of its construction is generally agreed to be sometime between 1400 and 1500. And that was really the state of things until I noticed something, which spurred on this paper and this presentation. So before I get to that, let me just also give you a little background as to why it has the names O'Brien harp or O'Neill harp. And that comes down to us from two of the great scholars of Irish history and antiquaries back when the field was just getting started. You have George Petrie and Eugene O'Curry, and they each they were friends. O'Curry actually worked for Petrie for a time, so they certainly knew each other, but they took diverging views of the harp, and they actually argued with each other through their publications, and we have it here today. So we'll start off with Petrie. Okay, so Petrie, who was the son of a Scottish immigrant who grew up in Dublin, arguably one of the greatest antiquarians ever in Ireland. He laid down the groundwork for tearing down the established narrative. You can read about, he goes on pages and pages. You can read about it in Geoffrey Bunting's work, The Ancient Music of Ireland, where Petrie wrote a chapter. But he effectively tears down this narrative for a variety of reasons and demolishes it so thoroughly that nobody really seriously believes it thereafter. However, on the harp, in addition to the carved markings which are ingrained into the wood, there was at one point a silver plaque that was affixed to the front of the harp. Now, the front of the harp is known as the forepillar. It's that curved portion in the front. We'll talk about that, and I'll show you pictures in a second. But it's the curved bow part in the front of the harp, which is bent wood, and it actually is what provides tension to the springs. Literally, harps come from bows and arrows. If you can think about a bow and somebody in the woods twanging their bowstring, the curved portion in the front of a bow is akin to the curved portion in the front of a Gaelic harp. And so there was once this silver plaque that was affixed to the front, and you can see it in the upper right corner of your screen. It has an upside down shield shape, and within it another upside down escutcheon that has the famous red hand logo. It's made out of silver, so it's not explicitly red, but there are what appears to be lions, one might think, as supporters upholding this red hand. And so to Petrie, this was a very, very clear indication that the harp was clearly from the O'Neills, because they are the most powerful family up in the north of Ireland. And while they're not exclusive, they don't exclusively use the red hand, they are the most famous bearers of that symbol, that very famous symbol up in the north of Ireland. It's used across both sides of the North Channel. Other clans have it. Other clans have hands of other colors. But when you say the red hand of Ulster, it immediately imports the history of the O'Neills into it. And so this was a sign, the fact that there was an armoral or heraldic symbol on the harp that appeared to be from the O'Neills was good evidence in Petrie's mind that this harp really ought to be categorized as an O'Neill harp. And of course, it was also played by one of the last people to ever play it was a very famous blind harper named Arthur O'Neill. And so that didn't really weigh in Petrie's mind as to why it should be called that, but it was noted by people. It should also be noted that Arthur himself regarded it as belonging to Brian Boru, at least in the statement he made about it. Nonetheless, the harp also happens to have some what are called Christograms. There's the IHS, the in hoc signo. That's a symbol that means in this sign conquer in Latin. That is sort of a symbol that where you put the letters together, and it's a Christogram. It relates to Christ. And because of this, it was also, Petrie believed it might have a monastic origin, or maybe have belonged to some famous O'Neill abbots or monks or churchmen. Against this, however, we have a couple of things. So the silver plaque, which once was affixed to the front of the harp, it's now lost. No one knows what happened to it. Somebody probably stole it. And there may have been more silver plaques around the harp at one point. Ralph Ousley mentioned that there was once more silver plate adorning the harp than is now to be seen. So it may have been just one of a series of other decorations, but suffice it to say, scholarship is sort of the agreement that the silver badge that was once nailed to the front of the harp postdates its construction, so that while it might have an O'Neill symbol on it, this could relate simply to Ulster itself, not necessarily to the lineage of the O'Neills, but maybe just generally to geography. Maybe it was just from Ulster, but rather that these don't necessarily, they're not good or strong evidence where the harp was made. You know, you can make something and then you can slap a label on it after the fact, and it doesn't actually change where it was made. And of course, going against the idea of an O'Neill origin for the harp is the fact that this is really just out of Petrie's assumption. There's no narrative or any kind of tradition that places it either in Ulster. It certainly was not discovered in Ulster. It was discovered down in Limerick City. So people maybe have doubted the O'Neill origins of the harp. And doubting it, chief amongst his doubters was his friend and former employee, Eugene O'Curry. And you can read about, he goes on at length, pages upon pages, as to why this is not an O'Neill harp on the manners and customs of the ancient Irish in volume number 3. So O'Curry himself was a Clare and I wouldn't want to accuse him of bias, but he certainly had to stand up for the O'Briens if he got the chance. And so he gave a list of reasons as to why Petrie was wrong and why it really ought to remain considered an O'Brien harp. First and foremost, because the traditional narrative simply states that it was. I mean, are the grounds for just disregarding the narrative, are they all that strong? Maybe perhaps the narrative is actually telling the truth. It was discovered in Limerick City, which, although it's in County Limerick, it's it's right within the Thomond area, so it's quite plausible that this was actually in the possession of the O'Briens from that geographic discovery. And there is a large praise poem for some of the O'Brien kings that mentions a harp. We don't necessarily know if it's the Trinity College harp exclusively, but the fact that there are praise poems for the O'Briens mentioning a harp, and then you might actually be holding it in your hands. This is something he tried to argue for. He also tried to argue that perhaps the narrative starting with Brian Boru might be incorrect, that it might have been another Brian in the O'Brien lineage, not necessarily the first great and high king that everyone remembers, but another Brian Carberry. That remains up in the air, but he certainly argued for that. So this way it would bring up the origin date about 200 years into the 1200s. Against this, however, what both scholars recognized, or sort of, was that there is no real O'Brien or Dalcassian heraldry on the harp. Okay, so the only heraldic items that people recognize on the harp was, again, what you see in the upper right hand of your screen, which is that hand. Okay, now that you would think that's clearly an O'Neill hand, but O'Curry actually tried to argue that the hand that's displayed on that silver plaque did in fact belong to the O'Briens. If you look at the O'Brien crest above their arms, it's actually an upraised arm that's holding a sword. And many of the Dalcassian septs or Dalcassian clans use that as a crest above the arms. It's hard to really confuse the hand with the upraised arm and holding a sword, but O'Curry was determined to make that point, so he tried to synthesize the red hand as an O'Brien symbol. However, it remains the case that most modern scholars do dismiss the 11th century origin, and it really does still smack of 18th century and early 19th century Romanticism. Okay, so now let's talk about why they really weren't wrong to think those things. Those are all good thoughts that Petrie and O'Curry had. Petrie and O'Curry and other scholars as well, they clearly expected for some heraldic symbol or some clan symbol to be on the harp and to indicate the ownership of the harp. They both debated that silver plaque and the hand, and they both debated who should own that symbol. But to each of them, it was proof positive as to who would be the owner / maker of the harp. And they're not wrong to think that, because there is actually a tradition in Ireland and also Scotland of putting heraldic symbols on the forepillar of the harp. So if you guys can see in the upper right hand, or just on the right side of the screen, we have this image here of a harper. This comes from Derek's Images of Ireland, where he made those woodcuts, and they're kind of they portray the Irish very negatively. But nonetheless, it does show a harpist, and that harp that he has does appear to have decorations on the front of the forepillar. So just pointing out, the highlight is mine, just so you guys know what I'm talking about. When I say forepillar, I'm meaning this curved bowed piece of wood out front. Okay, so the expectation that there would be some sort of symbol, it's not an incorrect expectation, but as we'll see, Petrie and O'Curry simply had the identification of the clans wrong. It is neither an O'Neill harp nor is it an O'Brien harp. But let's talk about this tradition of heraldry on harps. There are a number of old harps that survive that come down to us, and they're well known. One of which is called the Fitzgerald Kildare harp. And you see I have the Fitzgerald arms with it's the famous white shield with the red saltire. This is a mid-17th century harp, and it bears the very well-known Fitzgerald arms on it. It also has a cadency mark of a crescent, which indicates a second sun. And above the helmet, we have, this is the very famous Ape Crest. The Fitzgeralds have an ape, or a monkey, above the helm as their crest. It comes from a legend that one of them kept a monkey as a pet, and the castle caught fire, and the monkey actually rescued a baby boy that was in the building. And so for that reason, they've immortalized that ape, because it saved one of the heirs of the Fitzgeralds. So we know that this harp, this Fitzgerald Kildare harp, must have been crafted for a Fitzgerald, because it's got Fitzgerald arms carved right into the wood. It also has a little engraving that says RFG 1215. There's been some dispute about the numbers, but it's pretty clear now. Everyone agrees it's the year 1215 and no other number. And that's sort of a memorable date in Fitzgerald history, because that's the year that Maurice Fitzgerald, son of Maurice Fitzgerald, so Maurice, son of Maurice, received his inheritance and became Lord in Kildare. So RFG, Robert Fitzgerald. Now, RFG is not Maurice. RFG probably indicates the person who it was made for. And so it was likely made in the latter half of the 1600s for Robert Fitzgerald. That's where the RFG comes from. He was the second son, hence the cadency mark here, second son of George Fitzgerald, the 16th Earl of Kildare. And so this harp was somehow passed out of the family. It was rediscovered. I think Petrie himself owned it for a while, and he himself returned it to the Fitzgeralds. But right on the very front of the forepillar, if you were looking at the harp straight on, you would see this carved into the wood. So it gives it the ownership in very little doubt. There's another harp owned by the Fitzgeralds called the Dalway or Cloyne harp. This is not a complete specimen, but we do have the forepillar and we have the harmonic curve on the top of the harp. It was made in 1621 for John Fitzedmund Fitzgerald of Ballymaloe, near Cloyne, County Cork. So you have not the Kildare Fitzgeralds, but another branch of the very large and mighty Fitzgerald clan. It depicts his Fitzgerald arms impaled next to the Barry arms of his wife, Ellen Barry. So you can see that down here, Fitzgerald over here with the X, or the Saltire, and the Barry arms, also very famous landed Norman family with the bars going horizontally. They're both red and white. This black and white photo doesn't show that. And then above it, it has a full achievement of arms for King James I. Okay, so it gives an indication of who was owning the harp, and it also shows the relationship. Notice how that the crown arms are above theirs. So the placement of these two memorial achievements on the harp, they're significant in their hierarchy, and it also is speaking to the environment in which the harp was created. Okay. There are other carvings on this harp too that are truly remarkable. Not only does it show these arms, but elsewhere on the body of the harp, we also have the names of many important household staff for this court. We have many of the household retainers, the craftsmen who built the harp, the artisans who were in Fitzgerald's court, including the maker, Donogha Fitzteague, and musician, the harpist who played it, Giolla Phádraig Mac Giolla. So we have actually a Giolla Phádraig here who was a famous harpist. His name is recorded on the harp out in Cork. So just as a clan society, we should take note that you never know if this guy was a famous harpist and he had descendants who took the name Mac Giolla Phádraig. There might be some descendants of this harpist today with the name Fitzpatrick. But their names are on it. So again, we see highly specific references on the harp to the specific courtly environment, that the harp bears the marks of when it was made, who played it, who was around it. So again, the ownership of the harp is in no doubt. Now let's take a look at the Queen Mary harp of Scotland. This is, it's extremely close in design to the Trinity College harp. It's one of Scotland's greatest national treasures. And on the forepillar, there are other symbols. Now, I should note here, you can see in the upper right-hand corner, here we have the forepillar again. This is an earlier harp, so the forepillar has a curved front. It's rounded in the front, and there's a double-headed salmon that runs the length of the harp. And so if you were to run your hand over this harp, it would be curved in the front, okay? But the sides of the forepillar remain flat. Now, in the other harps that we've seen, the front is actually, the front is a little bit flat to put the coat of arms on it. But on the Queen Mary, like the Trinity College harp, we have on the sides of the forepillar 4 roundels, 2 on the left and 2 on the right. So 2 above and 2 below, left and right. And into the Queen Mary are carved these great beasts, which look pretty fanciful. We see a lion, we see a griffin, we see, this is, believe it or not, this is a unicorn and an otter. And the otter is eating a fish. And throughout heraldry and throughout Western Europe in general, otters, when you were going to depict an otter, to make sure everyone understood it was an otter, you almost always put a fish in its mouth. So you wouldn't confuse it with a rat or a dragon or a snake or anything like that. So all throughout European heraldry, otters come with fish. It's, you know, the unicorn is not trying to feed him a fish. The otter just has a fish because that lets you know it's an otter. And then we have a wyvern over here with 2 legs. Well, harp expert Simon Chadwick has positively identified this very rare symbol right here, the unicorn with the otter. He has identified that on the arms of some Mackinnon chiefs who are buried on Iona. They have carved grave slabs that sit in Relic Odran, which is one of the churches where many great lords of the MacDonalds and also I think the Mackinnons are buried there. And they have these wonderful grave slabs that are carved, and on one of the shields being held by a Mackinnon chief is this very unique and highly specific symbol. It's a unicorn. It's tough to see in this image, but this is a unicorn, and it is above a otter with a fish. Now, I've oriented this particular photo sideways. The way it's oriented in life is it's vertical, actually. So the unicorn is facing skyward. It appears that the artist simply rotated the creatures just to be able to fit it within the confines of a Norman-style shield. The orientation of the animals was less meaningful for this stone carver, so long as he got the animals correct, a unicorn over the otter. It's important to know that they're not the only symbols. There's also large crosses that have wonderful vines that are growing on them, and one of the Mackinnon chiefs is buried, also has a griffin that is very close to this griffin over here. So we see these symbols appearing on the Queen Mary harp above. We see them appearing on the graves of the Mackinnons below. And this is strong evidence that these symbols likely belonged in some capacity to the Mackinnon clan of the 1400s. On the Mackinnon arms of Scotland today, either on the arms or on the crest, they don't use these symbols anymore, but the Mackinnon chiefs who held high rank under the MacDonalds when they were Lords of the Isles, those Mackinnon chiefs from the 1400s, they did use these symbols. And so this is good evidence that somehow the Queen Mary harp of Scotland actually is associated with Mackinnons. But it still remains a little bit up in the air, but it's pretty good evidence because this is a very rare and unique symbol. I also have down here an otter from the Book of Kells, written much earlier than that harp was made. But just to show you, there's actually an otter holding a fish in his mouth, just to let people know that's what otters look like when they have fish in their mouths. Okay, so the Queen Mary harp, it is, that's supposed to say oldest. It's the oldest 15th century harp in Scotland. It was carved in the West Highlands, and it is the most similar harp to the Trinity College harp. And we talked about how the Mackinnon chiefs are identified with it because their clan symbol that they once used, they no longer use it, but that now it's on the harp. So it has some association with them. These 2 harps, the Queen Mary and the Trinity, they display a set of older clan symbols that probably long predate the Norman arrival in Ireland. And that's why these symbols are not found within a Norman style shield shape. They're in a round circle. And we know that the Irish have been using symbols on banners and flags from at least the 600s. The Battle of Maghera up in the north famously has the green flag with the gold lion that was supposedly the symbol of the Red Branch. And that is still used by a number of Irish families who claim descent from the Red Branch in Ulster. Most notably, the O'Moores of County Laois, who lived right next door to the Fitzpatricks. They're transplants. They're not natively from County Laois. The O'Moores came in, and the O'Moore arms are actually a green shield with a gold lion and some gold stars. So we see that there's a great consistency in the usage of these symbols, and Gaelic shields were, for the most part, round anyway. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that what we're looking at is a pre-Norman type of Gaelic heraldry. And perhaps another term might be coined for it, which is something else I might be cooking up in the works. I won't tell you too much on that. But certainly a set of pre-Norman Irish symbols adorn both harps. The Queen Mary harp has been radiocarbon dated by a researcher named Karen Loomis, who has done, I shouldn't say radiocarbon dating. Actually, I think it's it might be C14 dating, but also dendrochronology, using the rings to count the years. And so when parts of the various pieces of the harp, from the sound box and the harmonic curve and the four pillar, were dated, they had a range of dates, but they kind of all centered on the 1400s, which actually was earlier than what they were expecting. They were really thinking the Queen Mary was going to be from the 1500s, but it was a whole century older than that. No such testing like that has been done on the Trinity College, but it's also good evidence that connects it to the MacKinnon chiefs. Okay, so now let's quickly look at the Trinity's geomorphic roundels. We have these four symbols on the Trinity College harp. On the upper left, we have these pair of seated beasts. Could be hounds, could be lions, but probably wolfhounds. On the lower, we have these two beasts that are paw to paw, and it looks like some bushing on a bushy tail. We have two boars over here, and we have a lion on top of the dragon, and the lion is surmounting the dragon. The dragon is rearing back to bite the lion. I had never really taken a good look at these symbols until one day when I saw it. I took a look at this one and I said, I know that symbol. That's a Fitzpatrick symbol. The two in the middle here are from the lower right and left, and that's why they're faded. There's been some damage to the lower portion of the four pillar and that area, so we lose definition of these roundels here. But this symbol right here, the lion and dragon, is very significantly on the upper right side of the four pillar, and we'll talk about why the upper right is significant. Okay, so here's a better image of that symbol that's carved into the wood. It's the lion and dragon, and this comes out of Armstrong's book on Irish and Scottish harps, and then this is the Fairbairn's crest image of the lion and dragon, and they are essentially identical. The position of the lion and the position of the dragon are exactly the same. The mouths are open. The right hand of the lion is actually extending over to the dragon's head. You can see some of his fingers or his paw popping out behind the dragon. I'll show you a carving picture. The dragon here in the roundel lacks back legs. That's probably just a stylistic variation. Dragons weren't always required to have 2 or 4 or any legs, or even wings, simply a great serpent being a dragon. And generally, all across Europe, they were regarded as symbols of evil and sort of in alignment with Satan. And so here we had this great lion conquering it. And of course, it could also be the constraints of the circle might not have permitted the artist to go with back legs. But apart from the stylistic differences, the image is, in its essence, it's the same. So this is a photograph, a high definition photograph taken by Shane Broderick. This was the image that I first saw. I didn't actually see the illustration. I saw this high definition photo first, and this is what jumped me out of my chair when I saw it. And I said, what? So again, we'll note that the lion is surmounting the dragon. The dragon is rearing back to bite. He's regardant. They take heraldic positions. The dexter paw, or the right paw of the lion, is outstretched. The right hand paw is a symbol of authority or power. You can see again, you can see more clearly here in the carving that his paw fingers are around the dragon's neck or on the dragon's head. They have an overall dexter orientation, which means they're looking to their own right and to the viewer's left, and their mouths are open, their tongues are out, the lion's tail is lashed over its back and has this great big bushing. And it's because the lion's tail is very bushy, by the way, that we can look at the bushing here, and we can also say, okay, this is bushing on the symbol with the two creatures are facing each other. We know they're not dragons, they have big hairy tails. Only part of that hair remains. So this is a very unique and rare symbol, just like the unicorn and the otter. What a bizarre symbol that is, right? And so rare and different. We, as the Fitzpatricks, we have this crest, the lion versus dragon. And I've never seen anyone else with it, but I wanted to make sure. So I reached out to a couple of experts, and I reached out to the office of the Chief Herald in Ireland, and I had a wonderful reply and conversation with Chief Herald of Arms Michael O'Coman, and he said, I have certainly never encountered the distinctive Fitzpatrick crest used by anyone but a Fitzpatrick. And there are many examples of this in the recorded books of heraldry that they possess in the National Library of Ireland, where the office of the Chief Herald is. I reached out to digital artist Eddie Gagan, who's famous around the internet because he's provided so many people with so many images and great digital illustrations. He's gifted one to us. He's a great friend of our clan society. And he said, as far as I'm aware, that crest is unique to Fitzpatrick, not just in terms of Irish clans, but it's also unique amongst all crests in Ireland and Britain. So this crest, this lion and dragon crest that the barons of Upper Ossory used, is used by nobody else, which is important because when you look at the various Dalcassian septs, many people use the raised arm with the sword of light, cleave sholas, that's held up. Many clans do use the red hand of Ulster, but the lion and dragon crest is completely unique to this very distinctive family in Upper Ossory. And the Fitzpatricks are a genetic isolate in Ireland. I mean, there are very few clans that are closely related to them, even by Irish genealogical sources, and they have this very distinctive crest. Fairbairn's Book of Crests also points out the singular usage of the Fitzpatrick. So we have 3 independent corroborations that this is used by nobody else. So we can say when we see this symbol, it stands out like a big red flag. The barons of Upper Ossory, or the Fitzpatricks of Upper Ossory, the Mac Giolla Phádraigs, are somehow associated with this because they have their symbol carved into the wood of the forepillar. And it takes a lot to match the specific positions of that lion and dragon. So there are some heraldic variations that occur over time, but they're all variants on an archetype, and that is the archetype. So here we can see some variations. Some artists might draw the lion facing the viewer, but also facing the dragon. Sometimes the dragon has wings. Here we have some curled up wings, tough to see over here, but the wings are there. Sometimes they don't have wings. Sometimes they don't have legs. All in all, then there are many more varieties than this. Examples I can show. These are the only ones I got the rights to show, to use in this presentation. But suffice it to say, you can look at many more examples, and the Fitzpatricks use this, and you can see all the variations on the theme. Now, it needs to be pointed out that lions and dragons have been battling it out in the minds of illustrators all across the world for centuries. The idea of a lion fighting a dragon is awesome. Everybody loves to see it. Everyone loves it. It's a cool thing to imagine. And it has many layers of meaning that could be imbued with it. But you'll find all across the world scenes in illuminated manuscripts and on church misericord carvings where lions do fight dragons. But in all of those examples, and I've looked through many, and especially the most prominent that I have my focus on are what are called church misericords. These are simply decorative carvings that are on the pews and pillars of Gothic style churches in Europe, in Ireland, in Britain, and the continent. Everyone was carving just fanciful decorations on them, and you'll often find lions fighting dragons there. But they always take completely random and different positions. So here we have the lion fighting the dragon. The dragon is actually sinking his teeth into the lion's mane, and it's going around in a circle. And there are many more of these you can see, but none of them take the very specific and quite rigid position that is seen in the Fitzpatrick Harp. We also have this idea that it's reinforcing the idea that it's good over evil. Okay. a century after the harp's construction in 1517, we see an illustration from Leonardo da Vinci, which pretty much is the exact inverse or opposite of the Fitzpatrick crest. Here we have the dragon, which is surmounting the lion, and the dragon is the one who is dominating, and it's the lion that's rearing back and biting back. And maybe if he had drawn another set of legs on this dragon, maybe the dragon's right paw might be resting on the lion's head. But it just highlights the fact that people loved this contest, this battle. You'll see it everywhere. But of course, they can't all be Fitzpatrick. It has to take that very specific posture, and especially within an Irish context, then it's a total match. On the harp are carvings that are also reminiscent of other Ossory clans. So you might expect, if this harp was carved for the Fitzpatricks, perhaps other branches of the clan or important clients might have their symbols in on it too, in the same way that the Cloyne harp has it lists the whole court and all of the important people in Fitzgerald's court. Well, maybe perhaps there might be some indication of the context in the Mac Giolla Phádraig realm of Upper Ossory. And so we see that the O'Dunphys, who are, according to tradition, they're a cadet branch of the Mac Giolla Phádraigs from one of the chiefs of Upper Ossory, Donogha, or one of the kings of Ossory, Donogha. Come the O'Dunphys, and there's at least one O'Dumphy arms that's recorded. I think I'll have to. Is it Mount Mellick? I'll have to remember his town where he lived. But he comes from Western Laois. He comes from the Upper Ossory area, and his arms are two foxes going paw to paw with big bushy tails there. And it's interesting that we see what are probably two foxes, could be two wolves or two canids. But I'm betting if that's a bushy tail that I'm seeing down there, out of all the canids, all the dogs, foxes are the ones that are known for having the bushy tails. And so clearly the artist who carved it was indicating bushy tails there. So it is reminiscent of the O'Dumphy arms. And then we have the two boars that are going nose to nose. These are clearly boars. They have ridged backs. They have cloven hooves. They have upturned snouts. They're clearly boars. Boars are very important and famous and widespread Irish symbols for various clans, but there are two of them. And we should always remember that the O'Doran Brehons were the Brehons for Ossory and Greater Leinster, and they served under the Mac Giolla Phádraigs whenever they needed them. And so on the O'Doran arms, we have a double colored boar. It's not two boars, it's only one, but it does have two colors. And so perhaps there was some modification of this symbol as time went on. Just as the McKinnons no longer use the unicorn and otter motif, perhaps the O'Dorans may have at one point used a double boar. Maybe this is one branch of the O'Dorans that were in Ossory or Upper Ossory. So this is not definitive proof, but it is suggestive of an Upper Ossory origin to the harp because it has what appears to be symbols from other Ossory clans carved in the wood. Now, the Fitzpatrick symbol is carved in the upper right, and that is significant because the upper right was the most prominent area of the harp in terms of where things were going to be. Back in the 1400s, 1500s, the long robes and sometimes sleeves of the harpists might obscure things, but it's been shown that early Gaelic harps were played not facing the audience straight on, but rather that the harpist would sit in profile to the audience with the right side of the harp facing the audience. Karen Loomis has written about this, and we see this a lot in other examples of Irish art, where the right side is what faces out, and it's the bass strings that are being played by the right hand and the treble strings being played by the left hand, and that this is opposite the way modern harps are played. But if the right side of the harp is facing the audience, the upper right then would be the most prominent place on the harp for displaying any symbol, and that gives sort of a hierarchical structure to the symbols on the sides of the forepillar, what's more important, right? And so whatever is on the upper right would generally take precedence on an early Irish harp like this. And the lion and dragon symbol is there. And so that is more indication that this harp didn't just have an association with the Mac Giolla Phádraigs, but was rather created for them in Upper Ossory, and that they owned this harp at one point. So we see this again, just noting the sides of the four pillars here. As time went on, the four pillars of the harps became rounded. And at some point they began to flatten out the front so they could put Norman style shields and other achievements on the harp. Here we have the Lamont Harp, another famous Scottish harp that's depicted at the right, and it seems to be in transition between the double-headed salmon that's depicted on the Trinity College harp is sort of modified and flattened, but yet it still has if you can see very closely, it has a roundel. So it looked like someone was trying to put an older style Gaelic roundel on the front of that harp. All right, so to wrap it up, because I think I'm over time, what are my theories on where this harp comes from? Well, around 1425, according to Carrigan, we have the Mac Giolla Phádraigs constructing Cullehill Castle. It was probably finished around 1425 or thereabouts. When you have a 5-story castle being constructed in Upper Ossory, that's a very expensive thing. It's coming at a time when the Mac Giolla Phádraig chiefs must have felt very secure and strong in their area, so that they had the money and the resources to construct a very large fortification like Cullehill. Cullehill remained their primary residence, despite building lots of other castles all around, and you can find maps of them on our website on the maps page. Cullehill was their chief castle until the Cromwellian destruction of it. But a castle and a court are the proper context for where a harp would also come into existence. Once they feel strong and secure and they have, they're hunkered down, then you would see the importance of getting a harpist and doing the harpist work of extolling the Lord and how awesome he is and how great everything is about him and everyone wants to be near him. So you would see that in a castle context. Okay. And they would be willing to spend the money for that. But yet it wasn't discovered in Upper Ossory. It was discovered in Limerick City, far to the west. So at some point it may have moved out there. It may have it's possible that it has some connection to the Fitzpatricks of the Aran Islands. They arrived out in the Aran Islands later on in the late 1500s, early 1600s, after the name had been changed from Mac Giolla Phádraig to Fitzpatrick. But they were very wealthy and they were one of the most affluent families in that part of the country. They were pretty much running the Aran Islands for a while. And we have to remember that the two guys that found the harp, Cunningham and O'Gorman, they come from that area. They come from Western Clare. And so maybe perhaps they encountered the harp, and maybe perhaps, as people have speculated, maybe they found the harp in West Clare. It has a Fitzpatrick symbol. It would have been brought out there by the Fitzpatricks of the Aran Islands. But then they concocted this Brian Boru story. That's possible. It's possible. But it's more likely connected, I think, with the Abbey of Inuscad, which is on an island. It's called Cannon Island. It's in the middle of the Fergus River, which outlets into the Shannon. And it's surrounded by McMahon territory, oddly enough. So here we have Clonderlaw to the west and Clonagh to the east. And the McMahon clan actually controlled this. And I'll tell you about the Abbey in a second. The Abbey was given over by the church to 3 successive Mac Giolla Phádraig abbots who claimed descent from the Lords of Upper Ossory. And their job was to make the Abbey functional again, shape it up, and run it. And they did so for 3 generations. And they came under constant attack and pressure from the McMahons of Clonderlaw and possibly the McMahons of Clonagh, who would constantly write all sorts of things about them to sort of delegitimize them and make them seem uncanonically fit, to make them uncanonical, right? So there was all these things, and this was kind of common ecclesiastical warfare of the day. If you wanted to oust an abbot, before you tried to actually battle him, which was a rarity, you would actually try to find him illegitimate for some reason. And so we have records from the Vaticans, we have records from Ireland at this time, where this was a very, very common thing all across Ireland, where people would just come up with things like, oh, this is an illegitimate son. He can't be abbot because he's illegitimate, and all of these things that are written. And of course, none of it worked. The Mac Giolla Phádraigs remained in control of Inuscad for 3 generations up until 1521. 2 of the abbots were named Dermot, father and son, and then the grandson of the first Dermot was named Maurice. And eventually they lost control of the abbot. So it's quite possible that the harp was brought out to Inuscad Abbey and somehow gets into the possession of the McMahons, who have been trying to get their hands on that abbey. And if you remember, the McMahons of Clonagh are the ones actually named in that very long, winding narrative, that narrative that's been dismissed. They're actually a part of it. And of course, the harp also, as we mentioned, has these Christograms that are carved into it. So that might also be a connection or an association with an abbey or some sort of monastic environment that may have been added later on after the harp's initial construction. All right, so just to wrap it up, thank you for sticking with me. Here are my conclusions. So the Fitzpatrick Mac Giolla Phádraig lion and dragon crest appears carved into the wood of the Trinity College harp, meaning that it's original. And this symbol predates their later Tudor grant of arms. So this would be from the 1400s before they submitted to the English and took the name Fitzpatrick. So it shows it to be a native clan symbol of medieval Gaelic origin. This is probably a very, very old symbol with the Mac Giolla Phádraigs. It's their dynastic emblem, and it is the dynastic emblem that Petrie and O'Curry were hoping to find. And it's very good evidence that Ireland's national harp is in fact connected with the dynasts of Upper Ossory during the 1400s. The harp was likely built, I suggest, a date of 1425, 1426. I failed to mention it before, but 1426 is when Dermot Mac Giolla Phádraig actually arrives out at Inuscad. So it's around the time that Colahill is constructed, believe it or not. And so the harp was likely built around that time for the completion of Colahill Castle, and was later transported out of Upper Ossory by a branch of the Mac Giolla Phádraigs, possibly the Fitzpatricks of Arran and West Clare, but more probably from the arrival of Canon Dermot Mac Giolla Phádraig to Inuscad in 1426. The long discredited narrative of the harp's origins may have some truth in its latter portion, as expected, beginning when the harp passed from a branch of the Fitzpatricks to other leading families in the Clare area or possibly Galway, but most notably the McMahons of Clonagh. Its associations with Brian Boru and the O'Neills remain spurious, and the harp has likely never left Irish soil. It probably never went to the Vatican. Just so everyone is clear, this is not a scientific dating, which has been done with the Queen Mary. It should be done, I think, with the Trinity College harp to get better ascertain the dating. But I'm using the date of the abbot's arrival in Inuscad and the construction of Colahill as my foundational dates. But it is, one thing is very clear. This is not an O'Brien harp. It's not an O'Neill harp. It's not even a Trinity College harp. As the marks on the wood reveal, Ireland's national icon truly is a Mac Giolla Phádraig Fitzpatrick harp. And I think it's very fitting that our clan, which is named after the national saint, St. Patrick, Mac Giolla Phádraig, also is connected with the beautiful harp that sits at Trinity College, Fitzpatrick Harp. Thank you all for being so patient. That's the end of my presentation. Here are the image acknowledgements, and I'll take any questions if anyone would like.
Could I just say, could we have a round of applause there for Ryan? That was a wonderful talk, yes?
Thank you, thank you.
Let's do the wave.
You're welcome. So thank you, Ryan. The whole weekend has been wonderful, got to say that. And while I had, while I had every confidence that it would all be well, it has certainly surpassed my expectations. It has been magnificent. I want to thank everyone who participated. The organisers had a shape on the weekend with the schedule of events and arranged for the presenters. The presenters who shared their knowledge with us. 2 of the presentations explained tools that will help us with our research, and 2 presented knowledge that is well researched, well argued, and well presented. I know you have spent the past few months preparing your presentations and trying them to make certain all will be well on the day. Some also prepared backups just in case something might not work. All 4 were great presentations. Many thanks for doing that. There have been many pointers for where information can be found, especially on DNA sites, and I encourage you to visit those. Can I add that there are educational, professional, and wills records that can add colour to a person's basic genealogy. We understand those very well here in Ireland, and if anybody thinks that we can help them there, you're more than welcome to get in touch. Don't overlook those. Thanks to the Zoom master who made things so smoothly all weekend, and to our host for everything he did. To all of you, I say, your contributions made for a very polished and professional weekend and a wonderful experience for those attending. It has been great. We certainly enjoyed what you did, and I hope you enjoyed it too. I want to thank especially you, the attendees, because without you, there is no gathering. I particularly want to mention today that we have had a number of people on from Australia, New Zealand area. We had more on last night. So thanks for getting up in the middle of the night. I'm told Norman Hunter is a famous footballer, and it would be interesting to know whether he's a a Gaelic footballer or a soccer footballer or an Australian footballer or what, but there you go. I really hope you enjoyed everything and will have good memories to pass on to your grandchildren. Day one had 29 Zoom devices joined in, and behind those, sometimes there were more than one person, some watching and listening off screen and enjoying the events, and others providing a technical expertise. Tonight's or today's session is in or around the same, so that's been great attendance. I like the way many of you have entered into the spirit of the weekend and have personalized your background with Fitzpatrick maps, crests and arms and other backgrounds. Judith is planning to use a castle. That's nice too. And I'm sure we'll see more of those in the future. This whole clan Zoom gathering has truly been a very successful and milestone event on our journey. So thanks to everyone. The year 2021 has been a significant year in our history and our clan society, and it is now time to take a rest and enjoy Thanksgiving and Christmas so that we can continue to 2022 refreshed with new horizons. I know Andrew is already working on next year's Scholars Prize, and perhaps we might be able to have Zoom sessions on a more regular basis. And if we're having Zoom sessions, it would be nice to see some of the faces too, behind the names. This is the unique, in the load period, I want you to download and install the Fitzpatrick Multimedia Archive. This is a unique resource, a magnificent resource, which adds a whole new perspective to your Fitzpatrick interest. Share any comments you might have about the weekend with Ryan and for perhaps publication in the newsletter. That should encourage others to join future sessions. So thanks again to everyone. Stay safe and keep well. And my final act.
Thanks to Peter, thanks to Ryan, Ronan for organizing this. It was so good. Thank you.
Good.